At the time of this recording, Superman the Animated Series is turning 30 years old this year, so you'll see a number of videos highlighting customs from that show throughout the year. First up, we'll be looking at the Anti-Kryptonite suit that Hamilton made Superman, as well as two villains who fought him while wearing that suit, Parasite and Metallo. All three only have pictures, and I'll add in video where I can, but since Metallo has the fewest number of photos, let's start with him. The design of Metallo was always a striking and memorable one. Paired with the iconic voice of Malcolm McDowell, Corbin was quite a surprise standout villain in my mind. Kinda like a Batman Beyond villain, just really cool to look at and even cooler to imagine having in hand and on the shelf. How could I begin to capture his look? Well, starting at the bottom, those are definitely some TNBA Joker slacks he's wearing. Moving up, he'll need two different arms, one with a sleeve and one without. Maybe I could just sculpt over one to mimic the shirt wrinkles. His shoulder could totally still be the TNBA Joker arms, too. Looking back, I probably could have still used Joker's forearms, but back then I wasn't as skilled with the Dremel yet and opted for thinner forearms from a Gods and Monsters Batman figure. His torso is from a Gods and Monsters Superman because he has a thicker build, but again, I think I would do it differently today and see if the Gods and Monsters Batman could work. Metallo's skeletal frame should have been skinnier, but I wanted him to still appear imposing to Superman's large build, so I went with the larger look. Alright, all that's left is his head. Who has similar features that I could build on top of to get a decent John Corbin? I can't remember now if I had other contenders, but I settled on Slade Wilson's head since he has that wide jaw and the eye patch on the right eye. Alright, let's get down to modifying the parts. Heat and pop all the figures apart to combine the Superman torso with the Joker shoulders and legs and Batman's forearms, or whatever combo you settle on, to do a test fit and see how things look together. Right away we can see that the waist is pretty tall and that Superman torso is wider at the bottom than Joker's waist, which makes sense. I think I'll Dremel the width difference and then lower the waist by sculpting over the joint with a lower stomach and shirt. Unfortunately, this means he'll lose waist articulation, but I figure he was going to anyway with that shred of shirt that hangs down around his waist. Back then I didn't know about the flexibility of green stuff, so that could be another improvement you might make later. Anyway, the waist is settled for now, but what about the arms? I sculpted over the left forearm in layers to achieve the right wrinkle and puffiness of the shirt and then sculpted on top of the right forearm to match the shapes of the robotic look. Again, I would change something about that now too. I would Dremel the arm down considerably to get it much thinner since I'll be building on top of it anyway. As it ended up, I think it's a little too thick on the right arm to look like a skeletal frame that would be underneath the shirt on his left. Dremel down his right bicep, shoulder, neck, and torso before you add epoxy on top of them to attempt to keep him a little slimmer. These are the shapes I added with my epoxy. The next part is up to you whether or not you want his chest cavity opened or closed. I used my disc Dremel to cut into his chest to get that familiar square hole which would then reveal his kryptonite. I actually went really fancy with this idea too. I found some Fisherman's LED bulbs that require only a slight contact to activate and bought one to test the size inside of his chest. It would work, but I would need my kryptonite to be clear if I wanted to see the light through it. What to do? We'll come back to that. Metallo still needs his trademark ripped shirt running across his torso like a sash, and then that extra bit on his wrist. As I mentioned, these days I'd use green stuff to achieve some of it, especially on his wrist, but I used epoxy here. Last thing to mod will be that Slade Wilson head. How is this going to work? Your Dremel is your friend here. Get rid of that hair, eye patch, and mustache, and then drill a giant hole in his right cheek. Carefully carve into his face to form that trademark Metallo grin, and you're ready to add epoxy. Cover his right ear, reshape his nose, add some lips, and add some messy hair like so. Add a little cheekbone detail on the metal skull side and some ripped flesh where the teeth meet the hole in his face. Okay, let's break out the paint. Spray him with your favorite primer and then start on the lower half since that's easiest. This color brown for the pants and then Vallejo black shoes. Vanilla ice cream on the shirt half and then this gray for the robot parts. You know I like my cell shading when it comes to shiny things, so he'll absolutely get the white highlights on his metal to recreate that classic look. Black details on the neck, right arm and face, and then white for his left eye and teeth. For his right eye I want it to glow, so I'll use my trusty UV green paint. Wait, we could make his torso cavity a little easier by using this UV paint on a sculpted epoxy kryptonite chunk. That'll be even better. I tried the LED light a few times for photos and it was way too intense, so this is what the UV light looks like on the paint instead. It's so cool. Alright, before we get to Superman, let's check out my Rudy Jones Parasite figure. 2 big keys on him will be getting his size right and the sharp lines from that white design he has all over. I didn't have a full Superman figure when I made him, but I did have his legs. The next best thing to a Superman torso is a Batman one, and I happen to have an anti-fire suit Batman available. Luckily it fit very well with the legs, so he became my recipe. Last thing I needed was a head base. Since the Gods and Monsters Kirk Langstrom has an appropriately long face, he should work fairly well. Alright, let's transform this into Parasite. The first thing I'll do is remove Superman's belt and boot lines with my Dremel. Next, get rid of Kirk's hair and most of his facial details. Batman's symbol and armored cuff pieces are next. Again, like Metallo, I would do things a little differently today than I did a few years ago. Back then I didn't use the Dremel as a sculpting tool and should have dremeled his cuffs down much more to a natural forearm to wrist transition. As it is, he still has these weird looking cuffs. Unfortunately, I haven't changed that because the detailed paintwork with the process of using the tape. Speaking of, let's see how I did that. Rudy is very simplistic with his 2-color outfit, but I still managed to squeeze in 2 more colors to complete the look. I started with this base cranberry color after some dull coat to prime. Once you've built up enough thin coats of that, grab some blue painter's tape and begin measuring and cutting to make that recognizable pattern that he wears. I used a very light blue for the white since the shadow color of the white is closer to a blue. For his 3rd color, I chose a darker red to mimic that shadow that he gave to form his mouth and around his eyes. Lastly, I used a UV clear color for his white eyes so they can glow properly under a UV light to look like he does when he's siphoning powers. Okay, there he is. He's simple, but he really evokes the show when you see him. On to his nemesis and the Man of Steel himself in a fancy lead-lined suit. Superman's recipe is as simple and obvious as it gets. No tricks here. I'll just need a full DC Collectibles Superman figure for this one. Let's start the modifications. The first thing we'll want to do is heat up and remove his cape, and then Dremel away his underwear lines and his boot lines. Lastly, before sculpting, take a little off the top of his hair so his helmet can fit better. There actually won't be too much to sculpt for him either. Add a little epoxy around his S to make it look flat against his suit and then smear it back with some water. He'll need matching boot and wrist segmented cuffs, and the part where his cape was needs to be filled in around his neck. Build up a little epoxy in 2 rolled layers to make the part that seals his helmet on. Speaking of that unique helmet, how should we do that? Because of the cylindrical nature, I thought it might work best to shape it out of rubber. I like to test out my rubber shapes with paper prototypes first to conserve on wasting the more expensive rubber material. I'll wrap the paper around his head and then draw out a rough guess flattening out the shape. Cut in a hole for the faceplate, and then I'll need a top to his helmet. Again, wrap the paper shape around the head and then roughly trace around the top to get the oval shape needed. If that looks good, transfer it to your rubber and cut and test that out. I think they'll work. This guy still needs a faceplate to complete the look. For that I need it to be clear and shiny and a little flexible. Normally I'd say figure bubble plastic, but I fear it might be too rigid. Instead, I'm turning to a 3-ring binder cover plastic. You need to find an older binder where the plastic is completely smooth, because these days there's a slight texture to those covers for some reason. Anyway, cut out a rough shape to fit the hole, and it can be sloppy. You'll need the extra edge space to glue the faceplate on. Now let's add some life to this guy. Since the S is already painted, you only need a main gray for the suit, black for the line details, and 2 blues for the armor-like sections. 1 for the base and 1 for the cell-shaded shine. Lastly, a light blue for his skin. Start with your dull coat and then build up your base gray in thin layers until it's fully covered. Grab this light blue if you want to mimic the cell shading on his blue parts. Follow that up with this bright blue to form the shapes around your shines, and then before we glue his helmet on, we have one more thing. To really sell the look, I'm going to paint his skin blue since that's how they showed the glass plate on the show. Now, because this is an Anti-Kryptonite suit, shouldn't he be holding some kryptonite? To form the classic jagged rock look, I'll start with a rough glob of epoxy and then let that dry. The sharp angles will come from my disc Dremel, and I'll just kind of hit it at random and turn it until I think it feels right. Paint it with the same UV green that we did for Metallo's chunk, and he's all done. He looks so cool like that. He's the one that really catches your eye when looking at the shelf, and I couldn't be more pleased with him. What do you think? Let me know below. And that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Drop a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more monthly content like this and occasional shorts featuring tips or additional customs. Follow me on Instagram if you want to see more customs like these and all of my latest work. Join me next time as we look at another JLU character, Green Lantern. Or is that Booster Gold? Hey, why not look at both? That's right, I'm finally getting to make Jon Stewart's iconic bald look with the goatee. Check out the rest of my catalog of videos while you impatiently wait for that next one. Have a good one, and happy customizing!